Hello, this is Peter Coughlin, the course director for the Business Economics course, and this is the results review for the Knowledge Check quiz number 2 of Business Economics. I actually scheduled this session on Friday before the holidays, but attendance was quite limited, understandable given the timing, but of course that was the only time slot available for us to do it before everybody left. But because of the limited attendance and because of the fact that I think this review is actually very valuable, I've decided to record this video and let students who are interested, and hopefully that's many of you, watch at their leisure. And that gets to one point to emphasize up front, which is I see these quizzes as much about education as evaluation. This is not my primary directive, or at least not my exclusive directive, isn't to evaluate how well you're doing or how well you're following these things, but it's actually to offer an opportunity for further education. Right? The quizzes are intentionally designed for it to be hard to get 100% correct, right? Which means that most students should have questions from which they can learn, and that's exactly what this results review is about. I'm going to go through question by question, the quiz, questions and answers and results. I'm focusing most of my time on those questions that prove to be the most challenging for students. But the objective here is not just to explain to you, go through and tell you what the right answers were, if you will, but have you understand the concepts behind them so that you can learn from that experience. I'm a strong believer in that you learn far more from being wrong than being right. And therefore, it's helpful to have students not get all these questions correct because they learn from that experience. You learn from the question that you got incorrect, and therefore, I know you don't maybe feel like it, but the students who are interested but got a number of questions wrong are in a better position than those who might be interested and didn't get as many questions wrong, because they're not going to have the opportunity to learn as much from these important concepts. All right, with that said, so let me talk about the aggregate. First of all, before we go through question by question, I'm talking about the aggregate results from the quiz. So this is some distribution statistics. So the scores range from a 30 to 100, roughly similar to the previous quiz in terms of the range at least. The median was 80, so the median's a little bit lower, and the distribution was such that not as many people got 100 on this quiz as on the previous one, and that's intentional. As I mentioned, this distribution is what we're looking to sort of spread out, sort of to separate, sort of get a good bell curve of student performance, and then we can always curve those scores appropriately to match our grading scheme at Eisenhower. And that's what we did below. So you see the grade ranges that we, as the faculty, decided upon. And somebody asked the question, why isn't 100 or whatever an A+? Well, apparently Eisenhower does not give out an A+. I don't really know. I've only been here a couple of years. But if you want to know why we don't give out A+, that's a question for someone above my pay grade. But that is the grade distribution that we decided upon. So with that in mind, then let me talk about sort of the question by question results. Out of the 20 questions, 15 of them, at least 75% of students answered correctly. Right. And for those 15, I will not give a thorough explanation, or as thorough of an explanation as I will for the 5 which were challenging. There are 5 challenging questions, right? And this is primarily for time purposes. As you will see, this recording will probably be pretty long as it is. So if I went into great detail and had slides explaining each one of the 15 answers, or each one of the 20 questions, it would not only not be a good use of your time, wouldn't be a good use of my time, and just nobody would actually watch that video. And also keep in mind, this was prepared for a 1-hour presentation in Baruch with questions. So it was designed to focus on the most challenging questions to have the greatest bang for the buck in terms of time. What were those 5 challenging questions? They were questions 1, 2, and 3 up front about strategic thinking and game theory, strategic thinking, and also a little bit of their oligopoly. So right up front were questions 1, 2, and 3. Question 10 on leader advantages, and question 6 about suppliers and customers, and particularly about bargaining power of suppliers and customers. There were also 4 borderline questions for which just over 75% answered correctly. So I actually have a little icon you'll see that tells me it's a borderline question. So I may see a little more about it. I don't have backup slides explaining those 4 questions, but I will talk a little bit more about those than I will about the ones that were clearly, a vast majority got correct. If you still have questions about, if I don't go over or don't offer a sufficient explanation for a question that you're curious about, please do ask first of all, your fellow students, because if it's not one of the ones I go over here, that means that the vast majority of all students got it correct, so they can help explain it to you. But also then, of course, talk to your instructor as well. So, but I will go through, at least talk to and read and explain to some degree each of the 20 questions on this quiz. All right. So the first question that was, and there's my little icon in the upper right there. You see the curious or questioning or thinking emoticon there. So or emoji. So the first question that was challenging was actually right off the bat, Nash equilibrium. So the question then, which of the following statements about Nash equilibrium is true? A, in a Nash equilibrium outcome of a game or strategic interaction, each player achieves his or her best possible individual payoff from the game. B, in a Nash equilibrium outcome of a game or strategic interaction, each player must be choosing a dominant strategy. Or C, in a Nash equilibrium outcome of a game or strategic interaction, no player has an incentive to make a different choice given what everybody else is doing. And so again, the keys to understand these questions, answer A really says that you're achieving your best possible payoff. You are doing the best you could possibly be. It's the best possible outcome for everybody. Right? B says it is that you're choosing a dominant strategy. You want to remember what that means. Remember, a dominant strategy means a strategy that is optimal no matter what any other player does. And C says that basically, given what you're doing, I'm doing the best I can. Right? In light of considering what you're doing, if I can't change what you're doing, then I'm doing the best I can. So which is the right answer here? So I will point out that the most common incorrect answer was A. So a lot of people chose A, which was that each player achieved his or her best possible individual payoff in the game. I've already told you that's incorrect. But just keep that in mind as I go forward. So let's go to the reading. What was your reading on this is the reading called Introduction to Game Theory and Business Strategy. So what does it actually in the reading say about what a Nash equilibrium is? Well, quote, a Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies or actions which each firm is doing the best it can given the actions of its rival. Again, each firm is doing the best it can given the actions of its rival. Right? Quote, Nash equilibria are not necessarily the outcomes that maximize the joint payoff of the players. For instance, in figure 1 of the outcome where both firms submit low prices is a Nash equilibrium. Yet both firms would be better off if they jointly submitted high prices. So this is actually I just copied from the reading figure 1. This is the Boeing and Airbus sort of competition. Right? And you can see it's highlighted here what the equilibrium outcome is, where they each bid low and they each get a payoff of 500. It is not, they could actually both do better if they could both bid high and each get 750. It is not the best payoff for Boeing. Boeing's best payoff is actually here, where they get $1,000, right? Airbus best payoff is here, where they get $1,000. So we can already sort of see that the Nash equilibrium is not necessarily where you get the best possible outcome, right? Because again, it's about strategic interaction. So the best possible outcome might be you give me all your money. Well, that's not going to be an equilibrium outcome. That's best for me, right? Best for you would be I give you all my money, right? But again, you understand the equilibrium outcome is that is going to be something where we're each happy with our choice given what the other player is doing. Also, remember here, this is the matrix we have for Lesser Antilles lines case study where we introduced this idea of Nash equilibrium. It's actually I think I've eliminated the low end and the high end just so we could see it better on the screen. So I don't have all the outcomes. You were able to choose a price as low as 800. I believe a price as high as 1900. But this gives you some idea of it again, and you should have worked through this matrix and talked about and figured out sort of the outcome of this game. And for example, we can think about one of the ways to think about the idea of Nash equilibrium is focus on any particular point. You can start anywhere, but let me start in the lower left where each firm is charging $1,000. We see the payoff to Lesser Antilles lines is 248 there. The payoff to Kronos is 274, right? But if we asked ourselves, is that a stable outcome, right? In other words, are we each happy given, to stay there, given what the other player is doing, right? I asked, in my class, I said, well, what if Kronos stayed at 1,000? What would Lesser Antilles line want to do? Or what if Lesser Antilles stayed at 1,000? What would Kronos want to do? And you can see, for example, if Lesser Antilles were to stay at 1,000, right, then what would be the best choice for Kronos? Well, they would be, if Lesser Antilles stays at 1,000, then they've got to look in that column, right? They're stuck in that column. But what is the highest payoff for Kronos in that column? It's that 495 number right there. So if Lesser Antilles was to choose 1,000, then Kronos would want to choose 1,200. Right? And so you'd end up right there. But then you say, well, would that stop? What if Kronos chose 1,200? What would Lesser Antilles want to do? Right? Well, Lesser Antilles would say, well, if Kronos is choosing 1,200, then we've got to restrict ourselves to focusing on this row here. Well, the payoffs to Lesser Antilles are the blue numbers. What's the biggest blue number in that row? It's 560. So Lesser Antilles would actually, if Kronos chose 1,200, lesser utilities would want to choose 1200, so we'd end up there. So again, we're not at an equilibrium outcome yet. In other words, equilibrium meaning that it's stable, that given what you're doing, I'm happy with what I'm doing, and vice versa. But we can then continue to say, okay, well, what if lesser utilities charge 1200? What would Kronos want to charge? Well, they would look for the highest red number in that column, which is right there, 813. So in other words, the best thing that Kronos can do if lesser utilities charges 1200 is to charge 1300. So we end up there. So then the question is, go back the other way again. Kronos, if Kronos charged 1300, what would lesser utilities want to charge? Well, they would choose the biggest blue number in that row. That's their payoff. And the biggest blue number there is 716. So therefore, if Kronos charged 1300, lesser utilities would want to charge 1300 as well. Do we stop there? Are we each charging 1300? Well, we can say, well, what if lesser utilities was charging 1300? What would Kronos want to charge? Well, they would look for the biggest red number in that column because they're restricting themselves to that column. Again, the notion of equilibrium is holding the other player's choices constant. What is your best choice? Well, here we sort of see that Kronos, the biggest number is 1008. Kronos would want to charge a price of 1400 if lesser utilities charged a price of 1300, right? And then from that point we might say, okay, well then if Kronos charged 1400, what would lesser utilities want to charge? They would choose the biggest blue number in that row, and the biggest blue number is 895, so they'd want to stay right there. And again, would Kronos want to change? No. The reality is, once you get there, that is an equilibrium outcome, and you could start anywhere. You could do what we just did anywhere. Start at any box in this entire matrix, and if you do that process of saying, well, if you're going to do that, then I'll do this. Well, if you're going to do that, then I'll do this. Well, if you do that, then I'll do this. If you do that process, you're going to always end up at that spot there. That is the one spot in the matrix where, given what the other player is doing, lesser utilities line, given what Kronos is doing, lesser utilities lines is happy with what they're doing, and given what lesser utilities line is doing, Kronos is happy with what they are doing. Right? Another way to think about this is what we're doing is every time you move right to what is the biggest blue number in the column, or what is the biggest red number in the column, what is the biggest blue number in the row, what you're doing is you're mapping out something called the best response, right? So this says for any price Kronos charges, what is the best response? What is the best response that lesser utilities could charge? Well, I've highlighted in yellow there, so you sort of see what's happened is, this is the biggest blue number. This highlights the biggest blue number in every row. Right? So it's saying that's the best response function for lesser utilities line. That's the best response that they can have for any choice that Kronos lines does. Right? And if you do the same for Kronos line, so now for any price that lesser utilities charges, so we find the best response for Kronos, so we're basically finding the biggest red number in each column. We'd map it out like that. And so the idea is, if you say, well, if Kronos does this, what would lesser utilities do? The answer is always going to be on the yellow line. If you say, given what lesser utilities does, what is Kronos' best response? It's always going to be along the blue line. And where they intersect, where each firm is best responding to each other, is right there, and that is the Nash equilibrium, right? Where each firm is offering the best response to the other firm's choice, right? So that is the definition of the equilibrium outcome. Again, each player is best responding to the other player. So and here's just a basic definition. Again, an equilibrium or Nash equilibrium is a set of actions or such that no player wants to unilaterally change his action. At an equilibrium outcome, each player chooses the best response to the other player's actions. Right? So we're each best responding. Given what you're saying, given what you're choosing, I don't want to unilaterally change my action. And the implications are, in any strategic interaction, you can generally expect an outcome at or near the equilibrium, right? Especially if there's only one equilibrium outcome. And in a repeated strategic interaction, you can generally expect players to adapt or learn and thus move towards the equilibrium outcome, right? This is something this is why it has value, because it is prescriptive. It allows us to predict sort of what's likely to happen in a strategic interaction. So back to our question then. Again, if we look at, answer A was international equilibrium outcome of a game or strategic interaction, each player achieves his or her best possible individual payoff from the game. I hope we've illustrated that that's not the case, right? It's not in that matrix, for example, just going back here to that matrix, right? The best payoffs in this are way up here in the upper right somewhere. The biggest blue number, I think, in the whole thing is let's see, 1799 is the biggest blue number in the whole thing. The biggest, red number is 2237, right? But so neither of them get that in an equilibrium. And neither firm gets their best possible payoff, right? But they're happy given what the other person's doing, right? Also, question B: each player must be choosing a dominant strategy. Remember, a dominant strategy is one in which A dominant strategy is where one choice is always best no matter what the other player does. Now, there are some Nash equilibria where each player is choosing a dominant strategy, right? But that's not the definition of Nash equilibrium. In fact, you wouldn't even need the concept of Nash equilibrium if everything was dominant strategy. Instead, as we sort of saw in the whole notion of this idea of a best response function, is that your best choice depends upon what the other player does, which means you do not have a dominant strategy. Your best choice is not always the same. It depends on what they do. So answer B is not correct. And in fact, the answer is C. In a Nash equilibrium outcome of a game or strategic interaction, no player has an incentive to make a different choice given what everybody else is doing. Right? So the idea is that it's not that you're making your best possible, getting the best possible payoff, but given what everybody else is going to do, I'm happy with what I'm doing, and vice versa. Right? Player one says, hey, given if you're going to do that, then here's what I'm going to do. And player two says, well, if you're going to do that, then this is what I'm going to do. And guess what? We're happy where we are. That's the notion of Nash equilibrium. So we did, of course, have to had you solve a game. So question 2 was an extensive form game. This is also one of the more challenging questions. This was, not something that was necessarily emphasized certainly in the seminar or lecture. I didn't talk about it in mine, right? And I'm the course director. But as I've sort of said, you are responsible for the essential readings, right? I'm very diligent and careful about not assigning something that is superfluous as an essential reading. The essential readings are what they say. They are essential, right? And they are required. And so the essential reading did talk deeply about how to solve an extensive form game, and we'll talk about it in a second. This is usually when we have an extensive form game, the question says, again, consider the extensive form depiction below of a sequential interaction between Bob and Sue. What is the equilibrium outcome of this game? The question itself is actually longer, had more detail, and explained it all to you in the question, but I've shortened it here, right? But again, this is typically describes a sequential interaction, right? In this case, you see the sort of decision tree, if you will, or sort of the extensive form game tree. Bob makes a choice, then Sue makes a choice, right? And the idea is, of course, that Sue gets to see what Bob does before making her choice. So how did the reading talk about solving this? So this is actually right out of the reading, Introduction to Game Theory and Business Strategy, about the extensive form. The extensive form depicts a sequence of actions and the corresponding outcomes. A node indicates a point at which a player must choose an action. Right? So in the previous diagram, the nodes are where you see the words Bob and Sue. Those are decision nodes. The branches leading from a node display possible choices at the node. The numbers at the end of the final branches indicate the ultimate payoffs given the sequence of choices made by the two players. So again, here, if we go down the tree, if Bob chooses act now and Sue chooses act now, Bob gets 6, Sue gets 4. So this is each payoff numbers here indicate the payoffs, down that tree of choices. Backward induction. We analyze the extensive form using backward induction, looking forward to the final decision nodes and reasoning backward, beginning at the final two nodes. Begin the final two nodes and determine the optimal choice for the second mover at each node. Now move to the initial node. If the first mover foresees how the second mover will act at the final nodes, the first mover can determine which choice is in its best interest at the final stage. The equilibrium outcome is for the first mover to choose its best choice at the first stage, with the second mover choosing its resulting best choice in the second stage, right? So the reading told you exactly how to solve this game. Let's do it, right? We sort of, again, we look at the end and say, okay, well, for example, up top, if Bob acted now, so Sue is faced with this choice. Sue can either act now or wait. And if Sue acts now, the payoffs are as such. If Sue waits, the payoffs are as such. Sue, of course, only cares about her own payoffs. So Sue says, well, if I act now, I get 4. If I wait, I get 5. So what's Sue going to do? Sue's going to wait at that decision node. But what if Bob chose to wait? What if we were here? Then Sue would have these two choices. Same choices, act now or wait. The payoffs are different, though. Now Sue looks at here and says, well, if I act now, I get 3. If I wait, I get 2. So, 3 is bigger than 2, so Sue will act now. So now we know. So now we say, okay, so Bob looks at this and says, well, I know that if I act now, Sue will choose wait, and if I wait, Sue will choose act now. Right? So which means that basically can eliminate from consideration that is not an outcome. Where I choose act now and then Sue chooses act now, Sue's not going to do that. So I can just ignore that. It doesn't matter if those numbers were $1 million. It doesn't matter what those numbers are. It's never going to happen right now that we've realized that Sue is going to wait. Similarly, down below, I can ignore this outcome here, because I know if I wait, Sue is going to act now, so I don't have to worry about that. So Bob is just looking at basically that he gets 2 if he chooses act now, because he'll choose act now. Sue will choose wait. Bob gets 2. If Bob chooses wait, the Sue will choose act now. Bob will get 3. So he gets 3 by choosing wait and 2 by choosing act now. So he will choose to wait. And the question then asks, what is the equilibrium outcome of the game, right? So the outcome is that Bob will choose wait and Sue will choose act now, and that was the correct answer. To that question, I believe that was answer C, on question 2. All right. So that's the second of our challenging. Remember, we have 5 challenging questions that I'm going to go into some detail on. The third of the challenging questions was a one that was more microeconomic, if you will, right? So it says we can draw the demand curve facing an individual firm in a perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive industry, but not for an individual oligopoly firm. The reason for this is, okay, so the question is saying, look, remember back to the first part of the course when we had a perfectly competitive firm or a monopolistically competitive firm, right? We were able to draw a demand curve. But we don't draw a demand curve for individual oligopoly firm, right? We can draw a demand curve for the market, right? But not necessarily for individual oligopoly firm, right? Why is that? Remember, obviously, for monopoly, this is the demand curve for monopoly is the demand curve for the market, right? But the question is, why can't we draw a demand curve for an individual firm when it's an oligopoly firm, right? And so the options are, the reason for this is, A, there are high barriers to entry in perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive industries, while there are low barriers to entry in oligopoly industries, okay? So think about that. Could that be true? Is it because there are high barriers to entry in perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive industries, right? Not free entry. But there are low barriers. So we do have freer entry in oligopoly. B, perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive firms are price takers, while oligopoly firms are price makers, right? Price taker means that nothing you do influences the price. You take it as given. You can't. Your quantity of output does not dictate what the price you actually receive is. The price you receive is taken as given. C, we assume that the prices charged by perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive firms have no impact on rival firms, but for oligopoly firms, this assumption is unrealistic, right? D, perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive firms sell standardized products, while oligopoly firms sell differentiated products. Right? Well, let's look at this. The reality is that we can actually answer this question mostly from looking at what we did in the first half of the course, right? So let me just make it simple. We'll go through the oligopoly counter example, but the reality is most of the statements in the previous slide about what a perfectly competitive firm or monopolistic competitive firm looks like are wrong, right? So you can eliminate those options right away. So here's just this is just a summary of, of comparing market structures that appeared, something like this appeared in the textbook certainly, right? But just generally understanding perfect competition and monopolistic competition, they both have many sellers. They both have free entry and exit, right? So the low barriers to entry, free entry and exit, low barriers to exit too. Long run economic profits are 0 in both scenarios, right? So those are the 3 things that they are similar: many sellers, free entry and exit, long run economic profit of 0. Now we get to some of the differences. So perfect competitive markets offer identical products. Monopolistic competition are differentiated products. So there's somewhat, again, the example of the Chipotle restaurant versus the other Mexican or even other different Italian restaurant, right? Substitutes. There's many perfect substitutes in perfect competition. So you don't care who you buy it from. They're perfect. In monopolistic competition, there's many substitutes, but they're imperfect, right? So the idea is that you do have a preference over one versus the other. You're not just going to choose 100% based on whichever is cheaper. Demand curve facing the firm is horizontal in the perfect competition. It slopes downward in the monopolistic competition. Firm market power. So again, perfect competitive firms are price takers. Monopolistic competition is price maker. What does that mean? That means the monopolistically competitive firm, right, can choose a price, and that will dictate how much quantity that firm sells, or choose a quantity that will dictate the price, right? But the point is, the monopolistic competitive firm's choices do dictate the price. Not the price is not given, and they have to take it or leave it. Profit maximization, again, you always have for any of these models, the marginal revenue has to equal the marginal cost at profit maximization. But here, for the competitive firm, you have price is equal to marginal revenue. But for the monopolistic competitive firm, because they have a downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue is actually less than price, or price is greater than marginal revenue. So going back to our answers then, think about answer A, right? There are high barriers to entry in perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive industries. Well, without even thinking about oligopoly yet, we know that's not true, right? We have free entry and exit in both perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive industries, right? So we know that answer A has to be false. Moreover, low barriers to entry in oligopoly industries is not the case, because that's why there's only a few firms in there, because you do not have free entry, right? We know that it's possible to have long-run economic profit in oligopoly industries that would normally attract entry if there was free entry, but there's not, right? So there are there's some barriers to entry in oligopoly industries, which is why they stay as oligopoly industries. What about answer B? Perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive firms are price takers, while oligopoly firms are price makers. Well, we know that's not true. We just said, and I went in great detail about how a monopolistically competitive firm is actually a price maker. It chooses a price, which will then, because it is a downward sloping demand curve, its price choices will dictate the quantity it can sell, or its quantity choice will dictate the price it can sell, right? Or the price it can charge for that quantity. Right? But the point is that, again, monopolistic competitive firms face a downward sloping demand curve. Therefore, they have some market power, and they are price makers, not price takers. So that is not the case. So B cannot be true. What about? Let's skip C for a second. Why? Because C is the right answer, as we'll talk about. But let's skip C for the moment. D is perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive firms sell standardized products, while oligopoly firms sell differentiated products. Right? Well, actually, perfectly competitive firms sell standardized products, but monopolistically competitive firms sell differentiated products, right? And generally, most models of oligopoly firms are that they are selling identical products or very similar standardized products, right? So in fact, both parts of the statement are wrong, are incorrect. So it can't be answer D. And so we get to answer C by process of elimination. Now C must be correct. Let's double check it though. So we assume that the prices charged by perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive firms have no impact on rival firms, right? That is true. Right? So the idea is that we take for example, the perfectly competitive firms, they face a horizontal demand curve. So nothing they do, right, can change the price. Therefore, they can have no impact on other firms. Other firms can sell all they want at the market price, no matter what an individual firm does. So the firms are so many firms that no one firm has any real impact on any other firm. That's the assumption, right? And that works in some extreme situations. Of perfect competition. What about monopolistically competitive firms? Again, they are ignoring their rivals as well. They are taking their demand curve as given. Their demand curve is downward sloping because there are alternatives, but the fact is that what affects their demand curve is about long run entry and exit. In the short run, they certainly they face the downward sloping demand curve, and they are price makers in the fact that they choose a price, given that demand curve. Right? But the point is that they don't actually impact the other firms. Their price choices don't impact the other firms. But oligopoly firms, we do not make that assumption, right? In fact, the whole point of oligopoly, the reason we introduce strategic interaction or strategic thinking in game theory with oligopoly is because there's a few firms. So my price choice will dictate how many people buy from you and vice versa. Right? So the old notion of oligopoly is that firms are making price and quantity choices that impact the other firms. Right? That is in fact that is the distinguishing feature of oligopoly. Right? So answer C is the correct answer there. All right. So we've actually already, even though we've only gone over 3 questions, we've actually already tackled 3 of our 5 most challenging questions. So those were the 3 of the 5. We actually get to here, question 4, duopoly price matching. This one, you see my thumbs up icon in the upper right, my emoji in the upper right. That means that the vast majority, more than 80% got this correct. So I won't go over in great detail, but suppose 2 firms in a duopoly, but I will just talk through it. Suppose 2 firms in a duopoly implicitly collude and charge a high price. How might each firm benefit from advertising that it will match the lowest price offered by the other competitor? Well, so price matching guarantee, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, how can that benefit firms? Well, is it answer A? The offer to match price is a way of deterring entry by other large firms, thereby keeping the market share of the existing firms intact. That's not true at all. That's not really true. It's saying, in fact, as you'll sort of see, is because it benefits them, right? A price matching guarantee, if we were in a price matching market, I might want to enter that, not stay out of it. So it can't be answer A, right? And moreover, if you're talking about matching each other's firms, it's not even clear it would have any impact by some other large firm. But even if it did, it would be a positive impact on them. B, in other words, attract entry. B, such advertisements encourage each firm to maintain the high price because if either firm cheats on the implicit agreement and charges a lower price, the rival firm is committed to retaliate and doing the same. That is the right answer. That's why they offer price matching guarantee. It basically says, hey, can't we all get along? It says, look, if you lower your price, I'm going to have to lower my price, and we both suffer, and neither of us gain market share. If you've got half the market and I've got half the market, we charge $100 each, right? We could do that. But if you lower your price to 90, then I'm going to have to lower mine to 90, and now we each charge 90, and we still each only get half the market, and we're making lower profit, right? So it encourages you. It signals that there's no market share benefit, no competitive benefit to lowering price, so firms maintain high price. So that's the right answer. Let's make sure C and D are incorrect. So C says the offer to match prices is a way of signaling to antitrust authorities the firms are not engaged in illegal collusion. No, right? It may not be illegal collusion, but it is certainly collusion, right? It is, in fact, it is a implicit price, matching sort of. You can't have an explicit, let's match prices. That would be illegal. But certainly, it does not signal that there's no illegal collusion. In fact, it actually suggests when you see that maybe you better look more deeply because these firms are trying to coordinate on prices. Answer D, the advertisements combined with the high prices assure the maximum efficient quantity of product is sold. Of course not, right? If you maintain any price above marginal cost, that's not the maximum efficient quantity. The maximum efficient quantity is only produced when each firm sells at a price equal to marginal cost, and that has maximized output. We know oligopolies maintain profits by maintaining higher prices above marginal cost, right? So certainly answer D is incorrect as well. Again, most of you got this question correct, or the vast majority, not just most. The vast majority got that correct. Oligopoly characteristics, this is question 5. This again, another thumbs up question. Vast majority got this one correct. Which of the following is a characteristic found in oligopolies, but not found in any other specific market structure studied in this course? Break-even level of profits, right? Actually, that's not necessarily a characteristic of oligopoly. It is characteristic of perfect competition, monopolistic competition. So can't be answer A. Differentiated products. No, we saw differentiated products in monopolistic competition, and generally most models of oligopoly assume products are not differentiated. Independence of firm, answer C. No, that's independence of firms is mostly characteristic of perfectly competitive markets, but also of monopolistically competitive markets to a lesser degree, but still true. What's unique about oligopoly is that interdependence of firms, right? Answer D, that what one firm chooses, what price or quantity one firm chooses impacts what the other firm should choose, what their best outcome is, what their payoffs are. So that is the distinguishing characteristic of an oligopoly market. Question 6. So here you see my emoticon of, so neither happy nor sad. That means that this was a borderline. So more than 75% got this correct, but not significantly more. So let me talk a little bit more deeply about this. Which of the following is a common distinctive feature of defense procurement scenarios? Again, this is based right out of the reading. A, firms selling to government are less concerned about profits. Of course, that's not true. They're as concerned about profits as anyone. It might be harder for them to maintain profits, or how they achieve profits might be different, but they're certainly as much concerned about as anybody else. B, major defense weapon systems involve established technologies involving minimal uncertainty. No, certainly major defense weapon systems have a lot of uncertainty and involve cutting edge technology usually. So that's not answer B. C, defense contractors benefit from the bargaining advantage of selling to a monopoly buyer. This is actually the answer that the most common incorrect answer here. It's incorrect because yes, they sell to a monopoly buyer, but that does not give you a bargaining advantage. It's a bargaining disadvantage, right? When you have only one buyer, you have very little bargaining power, right? So defense contractors sell to a monopoly buyer, but they do not benefit from the bargaining advantage. It is not to their benefit that there is a monopoly buyer, right? It could be to their benefit if they are the only supplier, but that's not what this answer asks. It is saying, do you have a benefit from the fact that you only have one buyer, right? That's not the case. We saw this, for example, especially in the Mason Instrument case in the competition with Eldridge, how the real winner in that game ended up being the monopoly buyer because they had all the bargaining leverage. So by process of elimination, the answer has to be D. Let's make sure it's true. D, small production economies and significant economies of scale often make it economical for government to contract with a single source of supply at some point in the program life cycle, right? So again, the idea that you're only producing a limited quantity and there's significant economies of scale, therefore the idea is that you're much better off. This goes back to the idea of natural monopoly we had in lesson 5, right? The idea that selling only that you're better off because of the more any one producer produces, the lower the cost per unit. You're better off giving all the production to one supplier. Doesn't always happen, but this is one of the characteristics that emphasized in your reading is common, that at some point in production it becomes optimal, at least economical, right, to make sure you have a single supplier. All right. So that's question 6. Question 7, here's a thumbs up one, so not very hard. R&D for weapon systems, which the following statements is true about funding research and development for advanced weapon systems. A, defense contractors are generally willing to independently fund all R&D for such systems themselves because they can be confident in their ability to recoup these costs with profits from future sales. That is clearly not true. they're very hesitant to do all the R&D with no guarantee that the government, the single buyer, will actually buy from them later on. So they don't do a lot of IRAD. I don't do a lot of independent R&D. B, because such weapon systems are generally based on proven technologies, there's no need for producers to engage in significant product R&D. That's clearly not true, right? Weapon systems, advanced weapon systems obviously require R&D, so it's not that R&D is not an issue. So by process of elimination, the answer has to be C, but let's make sure that's true. C, to induce defense contractors to pursue R&D, government often provides prizes for innovation by directly funding R&D and or providing an implicit or explicit advantage for innovators in competitions at the production phase, right? So again, the idea is that to encourage firms to do the R&D, they either pay for it themselves, yes, right? Government gives out R&D contracts to defense contractors to say, look, do the R&D, right? Or says, look, you do the R&D and you will, and even if you pay for some of it or all of it yourself, we are going to give you an advantage, either implicitly or explicitly, at the production phase. So the idea is you're going to recoup your costs because you're going to have an advantage once we get to production. All right, question 8, government holdup. Again, a thumbs up icon here. So the vast majority of you got this one right. How does government overcome the holdup problem in which defense contractors are hesitant to invest in research or assets that are specific to, i.e. only can be sold to a single buyer, right? So this is the monopsony problem, right? The idea is if you only have one buyer, right, the idea is that I know I can only sell to you. So why would I spend lots and lots of money, right, to get into the market to sell to you, right, knowing that once I do, you have no incentive to recoup me for my investment that I've already made, right? The idea is if I build the classic example is if I'm a railroad company and I build a railroad spur just to your mine, so it only serves your copper mine, right? Then how am I ever going to recoup the costs of building that rail line to your copper mine? Right? Because after that I've got no other use for that except to sell to you. So you can only, as long as you pay me just enough to cover the cost of transportation, I'll never recoup the upfront capital cost of building that rail line in the first place. That's the holdup problem when you only have a single buyer. So how does government solve this? A, government will often directly fund R&D that is specific to a particular defense application. We just saw that. That was a previous question. B, government will often directly fund investment in specific, i.e. special use production assets or tooling, right? So beyond R&D, if you've got to develop equipment, physical capital at your production facility that can only be used to make that particular system, for the government, then they will fund that. Yes, we see that often happens. Not only is it referenced in the reading, we saw that happened in the Mason Instrument case study. C, regulations will often require government to pay defense contractors a fair price based on estimated cost plus some measure of profit. Again, in the reading, they talk about that the idea is that regulations say, hey, you've got to offer a fair level. Not only can your objective is not always get the lowest possible cost, lowest possible price that the government pays, but in fact to pay the defense contractor enough of a profit margin to cover the fixed investments they've made in order to get to that point, right? And the answer, of course, is D. All of the above are true. These are specifically out of the reading. It tells you that these are all ways that government overcomes the holdup problem, and obviously, given the thumbs up, the vast majority of you got that answer correct. Question 9, leader advantages. Here's an example. It's actually an example. Obviously, most of you got some. This is an example that I actually experienced myself when working with a small toothpaste manufacturer in the Philippines named Lamoyan. Makes a product called Happy Toothpaste. Anyway, but in the process of producing toothpaste, a certain amount of, quote, waste product, unquote, is produced, which is not of sufficient consistency or aesthetic quality to use in toothpaste, but which still has effective cleansing properties. Thus, a toothpaste manufacturer, which also produces other household products, such as certain varieties of dish soap or kitchen cleanser, can use the waste product from toothpaste manufacturing as an input to these other household cleaning products. This is an example of which leader advantages. And the answer is, okay, well, let's go through them, right? So in other words, this is an advantage if the manufacturer gets a benefit from producing other products, right? So the idea is that the waste from one product can be used in another product, right? So if you were only a toothpaste manufacturer, you would throw that away and you get no economic benefit of that waste. If you're only a producer of dish soap, right, you would not get the benefit of the input of the waste from the toothpaste, right? So this is a situation where a manufacturer gets benefit from having multiple products, right? What is that? That is scope economy. Scope, right? The product scope. You offer a scope of product or services that there is some complementarity among them, right? Either that lowers your costs or raises the customer willingness to pay because you offer multiple products or multiple services. That is the definition of scope economies. It's not scale economies. Scale economies is about the more you produce of one product, the lower cost per unit of that one product. So that's not the case. Learning effects is about the more you produce of something over time, the cumulative production. It is not about how much you're producing this period, but how much you produce over time. That is the notion of learning effects. Right? Network effects is the idea that the more people buy your product, the more that that other people value your product, right? And we'll talk a little bit about network effects in a minute. And preemption is, of course, the idea of an advantage of a first mover advantage of getting there first and preempting some input, some access, some positioning, some location, something like that. So that is not. So the answer is clearly B, and that's a thumbs up on this. Question 10. Now we get to our fourth out of our 5 challenging questions. It's about leader advantages. And it was the following. In the semiconductor industry, with the increasing production yields over time and resulting lower cost per unit, following the introduction of a new product, increasing cumulative output is an example of which leader advantage. Right? So the key here, the key words in this question are going to be, over time here, lower cost per unit over time and increasing cumulative output. The output you've produced over the last several years or several months or whatever it is, right? The idea is we're talking about time, right? Time is how cost goes down as time or cumulative output goes up, not how period output goes up. So let's talk about that. So let's think about, again, is it scale economies, scope economies, learning effects, network effects, preemption, right? Well, most of those, so these are again going back, let's step back to the reading on leader advantage, disadvantages. So we actually have sort of the reading broke down the leader advantages into size advantages and timing advantages. And you'll see the size advantages, scale, scope, learning, network effects. Those are 4 of our 5 answers. So we'll talk in more detail about those there. Timing advantage, preemption, repetition effects, bioefficient costs, patents or institutional barriers. Finally, leader disadvantages, which we're not talking about in this particular question, but pioneering costs, demand uncertainty, technological uncertainty, and incumbent inertia. So let's focus on leader size advantages here because those are actually the ones that are 4 of the 5 answers are about that, and that's really what I want to talk about here. So if you go through each of these leader size advantages, this is just so you understand, again, the educational purpose of this quiz. So each of these, each of these leader size advantages, you can actually draw sort of a virtuous cycle, if you will. A scale economy is that, look, as you produce a lot, you get a lower cost per unit. That's the basic idea. The more you produce, the lower your cost per unit, right? So the idea is the more, but it's also producing a lot in a given period, right? The idea is that how much I produce this month, this year, whatever, the more I produce this period, the lower cost per unit. Where does that come from? It can actually come from several places. First of all, fixed costs, right? If you're producing, whether it be the fixed cost of your overhead, of the rent of your space, or it be the advertising you're spending this month, or whatever it might be, you have some fixed cost that you spread over more units, so it creates a lower average fixed cost, right? That would be the idea of an economy of scale. For example, in advertising would be that the more you produce, the lower cost per unit. A big advantage, for example, for Coke and Pepsi is that they spend enormous amounts in advertising, but very, very little per unit because they have such a large volume. It could be input purchase savings. You could be a big buyer, right? Because you're producing a lot, you are buying more of that input. Therefore, you might get better, lower purchase savings, which is a lower average variable cost. It's important to distinguish the economies of scale can come from both lower fixed costs or lower variable costs per unit. Or some sort of operating efficiencies. The reality is that producing one unit, right, can be very labor intensive and very, on a per unit basis. Whereas, if you get sort of the assembly line approach, you get operating efficiencies that produce declining average variable costs. So again, the source of scale economies can come from a number of different places, right? It could be because you lower average fixed costs. Most people think about that. When they think about, you spread your fixed costs over more unit. That's the people think about economies of scale. But it can also be, lower input purchase prices. It could also be, operating efficiencies, which allow you to have lower average variable costs. But the idea is that because you achieve a lower cost per unit, you are able to set a low price, charge a low price for your product, right? Which then allows you to sell a lot. So then you produce a lot. And so again, this virtuous cycle of scale economy. That's the notion of scale economies. What about scope economies? We already talked about that in the previous question, but this is the idea that, look, the more you produce, right, it could be that you have a broader product line, there you share activities across products, you somehow achieve a lower cost per unit, right, and that allows you to earn higher profits and expand your product line, so you have this cycle here or there. It could be that you offer, a broader product line provides higher value to the buyer. The buyer may prefer to have a one-stop shop where they can get multiple, sort of products in the same same provider. So again, but the bottom line is you're either lowering costs or raising one's pay because you offer a broader scope of product or services, not that you produce more of each, but a broader scope of product or services. Learning or experience effects, right, are this idea that it looks very similar to the scale economies, but the difference is you produce a lot cumulatively, right? It is not. This is the key thing. The benefit, for example, of the economies of scale in advertising are about the idea that I spend this much on advertising this period, and therefore I spread it over the number of units I produce this period, whether it be a month or a year or whatever. Right? But learning experience effects they're not about that at all. They're about how much you've produced over time, what you've learned from that production. Right? So learning and getting better over time because you've been doing it for an extended period. That is, or not necessarily extended period, but you've produced a lot of units. You got to make a lot of mistakes to learn how to have a lot of successes. Network effects, right? So the network effects is the last of our leader size advantage. The idea of there's two types, first order, or sometimes called direct network effects, where the idea is the value to the customer increases as the installed base grows. The classic example here is a fax machine. The value of a fax machine is directly related to the number of fax machines that are out there, right? Because you communicate, between fax machines, right? So the idea is that the value of a product depends upon how many other people also have that product. The second order is an indirect that don't directly care about how many other people have that product, right? But the idea might be, think about, pre-internet, pre-Bluetooth, pre-Wi-Fi sort of video games, right? The value of the Nintendo Entertainment System in the 80s was customers valued the product more, not directly because other people had the product, but because there were more games for it. Right? The more people have the Nintendo Entertainment System, the more games were written for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Therefore, that caused the value of that to go up, and therefore they could sell more and increase their installed base. Right? So when this network effect goes through the complements here, that is what is a second order or indirect network effect. So those are the leader size advantages. You should already figure out that from that, again, from the question, talking about semiconductor output over time as cumulative production increases, right? We are talking about a learning effect, right? So let me go more deeply into what learning effect is. This is quoting directly from the reading Leader's Advantage. Learning effects or experience effects are based on the idea that the more experience a firm has in producing a particular good or providing a particular service, the better the firm becomes at doing so. While scale economies, scope economies, network effects are advantages based on the size at a particular point in time, learning effects are advantages stemming from a firm's accumulated size over time. So the key is cumulative output over time, right? So this is the exhibit. This is straight out of the reading. Exhibit 4 below depicts the shape of a long-run average cost curve in an industry with significant learning effects. Again, the key here is the horizontal axis is total cumulative output. Right? The cost per unit goes down as you produce more, the cumulative output, not what you produce this month, not what you produce this year, but what you've produced over time of that particular product, right? The distinction is here, if you saw a cost curve like this for scale economies, the horizontal axis would be total output this period, right? Or total output, not total cumulative output. So again, what we have here in the semiconductor industry, the idea is that what we saw in the Intel case study, for example, is that as they produce more, yields go up, which means basically you've got to learn how to do the new process. Every new generation of semiconductor technology requires new production processes, and you don't get it right at first. You will produce, those wafers, it takes 30 days plus for each wafer to be produced. And you might put all this effort in, and you're making this wafer, and it comes out, and it's completely useless because you got a speck of dust on it. Right? Or something went wrong. So the idea is you learn about the process over time, and you only do that by producing more. You learn as you produce, and you make a lot of mistakes early on. But as you get better output, that lowers your costs, right? Because the idea is your cost per unit goes down because you're producing more quality units. Again, the language very clear here, over time, cumulative. This is scope economies, learning effects, not scale economies. Scale economies was the most common wrong answer. This is an important, I actually was very pleased in many ways to see that people were challenged by this question, because this is a hugely important but oftenly encountered mistake. People often confuse scale economy with learning effects. So don't feel bad if you did that. It happens all the time, but it is very important for you to understand the distinction here. This is about learning effects, not scale economies. Understand the difference of those, right? Because a firm might have a scale advantage but a learning disadvantage, or a learning advantage but a scale disadvantage. They do not come one and the same. All right. So question 11, leader advantages. It has been argued that VHS became the dominant standard for video cassette recorders over the perhaps technically superior Betamax standards, primarily due to the wider availability of movies and other video programming recorded on tapes using the VHS format as opposed to the Betamax format. Which leader advantage is most clearly illustrated in this story, right? So again, it's saying, how do you become the dominant standard? Even if you're not technically superior, you might be technically inferior, but the reason you became dominant is because the availability of movies and video programming on tapes. So the idea is that what made the VHS VCR more valuable than the Betamax VCR, right? It wasn't because it was technically better, but because there was more movies available, more video programming, more VHS tapes were available. Well, we just went through that. What is that? That is a network effect. In particular, it's a second order network effect, right? The idea is that as the availability of complements, in this case, the tapes or the movies, the things recorded on those tapes increased, the more the value of that platform became more valuable. That is the classic example of the second order network effect, and the classic story about it with the VHS versus Betamax story. All right, question 12. This was an easy one for most of you. The wording of frequent flyer miles, which accumulate benefits for customers who repeatedly travel with a particular airline, helps provide established airlines with which type of leader advantage. This is a buyer switching cost, right? This is important to understand, right? We sort of think that the United Airlines or American is being nice to us, giving us frequent flyer miles, rewarding our loyalty. No, what they're doing is they're creating lock-in. They're trying to make it difficult for you, right? The idea being that you say, look, here's, should I fly with American or United? Well, I've got a lot of United frequent flyer miles, and I want to accumulate my frequent flyer miles on United. Oh, but geez, that it costs $10 extra to fly United. Well, it's worth it because I get the frequent flyer miles, right? That's the idea. It's creating buyer switching costs. It's making it a little more costly for you because you're giving up the frequent flyer benefit if you go to an airline that for which you do not have you either have no miles or not have any accumulated miles or some level of seniority or status on that airline. Question 13, leader disadvantages. Again, a relatively easy question. The potential that changes to previous commitments could cannibalize sales of current products or jeopardize existing external relationships. An example of which leader disadvantage? Technological uncertainty is where basically you bet on the wrong technology, or the technology is not good enough for the market yet, right? So you bet on Blu-ray, or you bet on HD DVD, and Blu-ray DVD ends up being the winner. Or you introduce the Apple Newton too soon for the the technology is not quite there yet enough for handwriting recognition, these sorts of things. Pioneering costs are basically you blaze the trail, you do everything to sort of make it easy for an industry to develop, and later followers do not have to incur those same costs. Incumbent inertia is the idea that makes it very difficult. It could be because of myopic sort of thinking, but more often than not, it's because you've made certain investments and you've committed to a certain product or a certain technology, and it makes it very hard for you to then switch later because of your investments. That's incumbent inertia. Demand uncertainty is the idea that you don't really know what the market wants. You're betting on what the market will want this product, and it turns out they don't, or they want something slightly different than what you've committed to. So going back to our question, the potential that changes to previous commitments could cannibalize sales of current products or jeopardize existing external relationships. Example of which leader disadvantage? That is incumbent inertia, right? Again, the idea is that the incumbent, when they have an existing technology, why was Apple slow to introduce Apple Music, streaming music? Well, because they're making a lot of money on their existing technology, which was of course downloadable music, right? So why people would say, oh, well, why was Apple behind Spotify or others? Well, it's not because they didn't see it coming. It's because Spotify didn't have cannibalization concerns, but Apple does, right? So the established industry leader is hesitant to introduce the new thing that will cannibalize their existing thing, right? All right, so question 14, which of the 5 forces here? If you were to conduct a 5-force analysis focusing on the market for new DVD and Blu-ray movie sales, movie streaming services from companies like Netflix would most appropriately be analyzed as part of which the following forces are industry elements. So what is Blu-ray to streaming, right? Well, they're alternatives, right? They're substitutes, right? I think it should be pretty obvious. Substitutes, again, a substitute, we got to think generally about substitutes. They're not direct competitors, right? Because they're not offering the exact same thing, right? Or very similar thing. It is a different way of providing the same service to the customer. The customer wants to watch a movie. They can either do it by buying a Blu-ray movie. By the way, also not mentioned here, what would rental be? Rental would also be renting a movie, a Blu-ray disc would also be a substitute, right? Rental is always a substitute for purchase, right? Used is a substitute for new, right? You got to think broadly about substitutes. And here, the idea of opportunity for a streaming service to be a substitute for a new Blu-ray movie sales, right? That is something you got to be aware of more broadly about substitutes, right? Understand the customer's needs, and anything else that satisfies that needs in a different way would be a substitute. All right. So question 15 is about entry and rivalry. In the context of a five forces analysis, which of the following statements about entry, competition, and rivalry is true? So only one of them will be true, and the others will be wrong. So let's talk about that. So that if an industry consists of numerous competitors of roughly equal size and power, this generally increases overall industry profitability. No, this is actually a description of a competitive market, right? Numerous competitors, roughly equal size and power, right? That when you have many competitors or numerous competitors, right, they intend to compete more intensely on price, so that decreases overall industry profitability. Right? B, rivalry in industry with perishable products tends to be relatively less intense. No, that's false, right? Because again, with perishable products, right, the idea is that and this could be literally perishable, like a fruit at a fruit vendor. At the end of the day, they don't want to take their perishable products back; they want to sell them, so they're willing to sell them cheap. So they tend to be competitive. They get intensely price competitive at the end of the day to sort of sell those products. And if customers are aware of that, they might wait till the end of the day to buy the products. But similarly, airlines, right? A perishable once a plane seat has taken off empty, it is perished, right? So the airline has an incentive to make sure that that plane goes off as full as possible, right? And so they had to try to resist the temptation to give away their seats practically for free, coming up to the time a plane is going to take off, right? So that's the idea of, again, when you have perishable products, there's this incentive to sort of, you cannot delay sales till the next period. And because of that, you have an incentive to compete and lower your price, and that tends to increase rivalry. Question C, an industry with high fixed costs and low marginal or variable costs will generally have more intense rivalry, i.e. price competition that undermines profitability, than an industry with low fixed costs and high marginal or variable costs, right? Well, that is true, right? And that comes out of the reading, so you just do the reading and it says that. But why does it say that? Think about this, is once you get into market, remember the offshore drilling case, once you get into market, right, you are going to price down to marginal opportunity cost, right? Your fixed costs at that point are sunk, right? Your fixed costs are sunk once you're in the market. So once you're in the market or you've committed to compete that period, your fixed costs are sunk. So if your fixed costs are sunk, you ignore them. And therefore, what happens is if you get into competition, you are willing to compete down to marginal cost. Well, if you're willing to compete down to marginal cost, right, how much does that hurt you? Well, how much it hurts you is how big were your fixed costs, because you're never going to cover your fixed costs if you get into intense competition. So this question is really about how painful is competition, in the industry. Well, it's more painful the bigger the fixed cost, because if you get real competitive, you're never going to cover those fixed costs. Well, if your fixed costs were small, that's not terribly painful. But if your fixed costs were large, that is very painful, right? And so that's why the answer here is C. What about D? The need to invest large financial resources in order to begin competing in industry generally reduces the overall profitability of existing industry participants. Well, what does it mean, the need to invest large financial resources in order to begin competing? So in other words, high barriers to entry. If there are high barriers to entry, therefore a low threat of entry, what does that do to profitability? Well, low threat of entry increases industry profitability. So if there's a high barrier to entry, if there's a need to invest large financial resources to begin to competing, does that reduce the overall profitability? No, it increases the overall profitability of existing industry participants, because entry does not come in to compete away profits. Again, a thumbs up question, a very good question, a very important question, very valuable for you to understand all of those dynamics on that question. All right, question 16 is actually our last of our challenging questions. So it's the last of our questions that at least 75% answered incorrectly. So let's talk about this. So this is, again, five forces. So in the context of five forces analysis, which of the following statements about suppliers and customers is true? Is it A, the bargaining power of customers and the bargaining power of suppliers are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will necessarily be subject to relatively low supplier power? Is it B, if the members of an industry supplier group or supplier market possess a credible threat of forward integration into the focal industry? The industry you're analyzing, this tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry. Answer C, strong brand loyalty among the industry's customer base generally increases the bargaining power of the industry's buyers. Or D, if customers must incur large costs in order to switch between vendors in the focal industry, this generally increases the overall profitability of that focal industry. Okay. So let's think about this. So I'll tell you now, the correct answer is D. But let's talk about the other answers. The most common by far, this is another one of those questions like question 10, where I'm glad it was challenging, because it exposes a very common mistake. The most common wrong answer here was A. So we're going to go into some detail, explain why A is not the correct answer, right? And don't feel bad if you put A, because the reality is that many of my students throughout the decades I've been teaching this stuff think answer A is correct. It is an easily confused point. It is important to understand why it is wrong, and therefore I'm very glad this question was on the quiz to help people understand why of a potential to, because it exposes the fact that students often get this wrong, and it allows opportunity to correct that misunderstanding. So if A is the most common incorrect answer and D is the correct answer, let's dispense with B and C first to understand why those are incorrect answers. B, if the members of an industry supplier group possess a credible threat of forward integration into the focal industry, the industry you're analyzing, this tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry, right? So if your suppliers could forward integrate, what does it mean to forward integrate? It means could they do what you do? So if they're supplying you, right, think about Intel supplying to Dell, Compaq, HP, Acer, Lenovo, these folks, right? Intel supplies chips to them, right? One way the case study talked about, they were able to get good terms was that they produced their own systems. It actually was a surprising percentage of their revenue. I was very surprised. But they basically say, look, if you're not going to give us a good deal in buying our microprocessors, we will just make our own PCs. We will do what you do. If your supplier can threaten to do what you do, i.e. forward integrate, that lowers your bargaining power and raises your supplier's bargaining power, right? So that lowers your profitability. So you do not want a supplier group that can forward integrate, right? So again, so answer B is a false statement, because it says if your suppliers could have a credible threat of forward integration, that tends to increase the overall profitability of that focal industry. No, it decreases it because it raises supplier power. And things that increase supplier power lower profitability for the industry you're looking at. What about C? Strong brand loyalty among the industry's customer base generally increases the bargaining power of the industry's buyers, right? This is one that not a lot of people put, but is a common misconception. Loyal buyers are not powerful buyers. They are weak buyers. The more loyal your buyers are, the less likely they are to switch away if you raise prices a little bit, right? Which makes them weak. They do not have a lot of bargaining power. They have reduced bargaining power. So again, strong brand loyalty among an industry's customer base generally increase the bargaining power of that industry's buyers? No, that is false, right? The fact that they're not likely to switch means they have low bargaining power. So we know B and C are not correct. I already said D, and we'll get back to D as the correct answer, but A is the most common incorrect answer. So let's talk about that. A says the bargaining power of customers and the bargaining power of suppliers are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will necessarily be subject to relatively low supplier power, right? So it is if you got high buyer power, you got to have low supplier power. If you have high supplier power, you got to have low buyer power, right? Because but again, the problem there is that people are misunderstanding what we mean by buyer power and supplier power. So let me go back to the competitive forces that shape strategy here, right? So here we have the bargaining power of buyers and bargaining power of suppliers, right? These are the suppliers and buyers, the buyers from and the suppliers to your industry. They're separate forces. They are separate five forces, right? So the idea is that you have buyers buying from your industry. You have suppliers supplying to your industry, right? They are separate. So when you talk about buyer power, you're talking about the interaction between the firms and their buyers. When you're talking about supplier power, the interaction between the firm and their suppliers, right? Those are two completely separate transactions. So to understand this, think about this. Think about this relationship between the buyers, the firm, and the suppliers, right? So you have some level of the customer's willingness to pay, right? The maximum the customer is willing to pay for a product, and supplier opportunity cost, right, or the willingness to supply of the supplier is dictated. This is the minimum that you could possibly pay the supplier and not have them walk away. Well, and then the idea is that, look, you could have a situation where you have low buyer power and high supplier power, right? So that here you have, so the idea is that here you have low buyer power, which what it means basically is that the price that customers end up paying you is pretty close to the maximum they'd be willing to pay, right? You've got all the bargaining leverage, so you basically bargain them up to basically close to their willingness to pay. That is the definition of low buyer power, that you're bargaining the price up close to what the customer is willing to pay. For high supplier power, this means that the firm has to pay the supplier well above what the minimum accept, right? They may be the only game in town. I'm the only supplier you got, so even though my cost is $10, I know that I can sell you for much more, so I'm going to sell it to you for $20, $30, $40 because I'm the only game in town, or some reason I have high bargaining supplier power. So if you have a high supplier power, this means there's a big gap between the cost that the firm pays to, the firm's cost, which is what they pay the supplier, and what the supplier would actually be willing to sell at, in other words, the supplier's opportunity cost. That's the notion of high supplier power. So you could have low buyer power and high supplier power. And then that's sort of a, in between, a mixed bag for the firm, one good piece of good news, one piece of bad news. You could have high buyer power and low supplier power, right? So here you see that the price is really low relative to the customer willing to pay. So the customer has high bargaining power and therefore is able to negotiate a low price, right? But your suppliers aren't very powerful. Maybe there's many of them, so you can negotiate the firm pays a cost pretty close to what the supplier's opportunity cost is, right? So that's the statement. But the reality is you can also have that they could both be high, right? You could have very high bargaining power of your buyers and very high bargaining power of your suppliers. So your buyers are able to negotiate or otherwise exert pressure that pushes price down far away from their willingness to pay. They're willing to pay something, but because they have high bargaining power, the only game in town, they have a lot of options, whatever it might be, they are able to negotiate the price down well below their willingness to pay, which leaves them a big surplus here. But it basically allows them to capture a lot of value, but it pushes the price down. And your suppliers, could be, also have high bargaining leverage, and so they are charging a cost well above what their opportunity cost was. That's the notion of high buyer power and high supplier power. It leaves very little unhappy face for the firm. But you could also have low buyer power and low supplier power, right? Here where the buyers have minimal bargaining leverage, so therefore you're able to push the price up very close to their willingness to pay. The suppliers have very little bargaining leverage, so you're able to push what you pay them, which is your cost, very low, very close to what their opportunity cost is. That's obviously the best of all worlds for the firm here, right? Again, the point being that they are not what we might call mirroring forces, in the sense that just because you have a low buyer power doesn't mean you get a high supplier power, right? Doesn't mean just because you have high buyer power doesn't mean you have low supplier power, right? In fact, you could have any combination of them because they are different transactions. They're talking about a firm's relationship to its suppliers and a firm's relationship with its buyers, two different relationships, right? So that's why answer A is incorrect and why answer D is the correct answer. Again, don't feel bad if you put answer A. It's a very common mistaken answer. It's a very common misconception about the five forces. It's something that Porter should perhaps clarify more, but we're clarifying it for you here. So again, this is why I see this as an educational opportunity, not a bad thing, a lot of people got this question incorrect. All right. Question 17, competition dimensions. Competition along which of the following dimensions is most likely to erode profitability: advertising and marketing, research and development, new products or features, product prices, service and support. Well, think about this, right? If you compete along advertising and marketing, right, that allows you to, one, differentiate yourself. Two, it increases economies of scale, which restricts competition from new entrants. Those things tend to increase profitability. Same thing with B, R&D. If you invest heavily in R&D, if you compete in R&D against your rival, what does that do? That increases differentiation, which raises bargaining power, also reduces rivalry. But it also raises the economies of scale, which restricts the potential for entry. So that, again, is good for industry profitability. What about new products or features? Same story here. You get to differentiate yourself. Service and support, the same thing. The reality is, it's very clear, this comes out of the reading, but when you compete along price, that is what tends to most erode profitability, right? Because that directly goes to the bottom line of the firm and reduces profitability. All the other things tend to maybe increase differentiation, increase economies of scale, and therefore increase barriers to entry, right? But again, these are all sorts of things that of course, R&D costs money. So does advertising, right? So it's not without cost, but it tends to actually, if you got to choose where to compete, and you will compete, right? It's better to compete along those dimensions that actually increase differentiation, lower rivalry, increase bargaining power, reduce the threat of new entry, than to compete on price, which does none of those. All right. Question 18. This is simply a fill in the blank. Suppose firm A and firm B both purchase inputs from the same supplier. Selling to firm A decreases the supplier's cost of also selling to firm B. This means that a firm A is a blank to or from the perspective of firm B, right? Well, the answer, as you'll sort of see, is complementer, right? And it's important to understand, this shows you, this is important when you saw the value net, those lines in the value net. The idea that a complementer is not just a buy-side complementer, right? They're not just on the demand side. It's not just that a complement to your product is something that increases your buyer's willingness to pay, right? It also can lower your supplier's opportunity cost, right? So the idea is that if a firm, so you have supply side complementers as well. What that means is the idea that if it's easier to supply to you because they also supply to the other firm, that other firm is a complementer to you, right? In this case, firm A and firm B. Selling to firm A decreases the supplier's cost of also selling to firm B, So in other words, it's easier to sell to both of you than to sell just to one of you. I can do it at a lower price because I sell to both of you. So firm A and firm B are complementing each other because they're lowering their costs, right? Because they're lowering the cost of their suppliers to supply to them. All right, question 19 about complementers. Again, a thumbs up question, so everybody almost everybody got this one right. Which of the following factors, A through D, is not a key consideration when analyzing strategic impact and implications of complementers? A, the overall availability of complements to the focal industry, right? Of course, I mean, that prima facie, if you're going to analyze the strategic impact, the first thing you have to know is, are there complements? Are there many complements? Are they widely available, right? That's the, obviously, anytime you analyze. This is not saying whether these things are good or bad or whatever. It's saying, what do you consider when you analyze them? Well, obviously, you consider the overall availability of complements, right? B, the impact of complements on the quality performance of the product or service provided by the focal industry, right? A lot of things have complements. They don't matter that much, right? But some things are critical. It's hardware, software. Hardware is absolutely useless without the software that runs on it, right? So the idea is, how important is that complement to your product? That will be an important consideration when you're analyzing the market for complements. C, the relative concentration and bargaining power of key complement providers. This is important. You don't care just about the availability of complements. You care about the bargaining power of those key complement providers, right? Are they able to extract a lot of the profit? Remember, particularly your customer may be buying from both of you. If all their money is going to the complements, they have left for you. If all the money goes towards software, they have less for hardware, right? Think about this for Apple and who the #1 software provider is for the Macintosh. It is Microsoft, right? That's not other than Apple itself. That is not a great position to be in, right? To be beholden, so significantly to one. I mean, Microsoft's market share of the Apple software market is pretty significant, right? And therefore, what that means is you have a complementer who you are heavily dependent upon, which is why when Steve Jobs, returned to Apple in the late 1990s, one of the very first things he did was get a big investment from Microsoft and a commitment to develop Office for Mac for the next 5 years, right? Because you really needed those key complements. D, the threat of integration into or from complement markets, right? Again, right? The idea that the one thing, for example, Nintendo was able to limit the bargaining power of its game producers, in other words, those who write games for Nintendo, because it is able to do it itself. The biggest selling games on Nintendo platforms are Mario or Zelda. These are things that are owned by Nintendo. So do they have independent software vendors who make games for Nintendo? Absolutely. And Nintendo depends on them. But they don't depend upon them as much as others do, because they are able to do their biggest blockbuster games are ones they are able to do themselves. So obviously, I just said A, B, C, and D are all considerations. So the answer is, of course, E. All of the above are key considerations, and almost all of you got this question correct. And finally, question 20. This was a type of question I don't really like. This is just a, test your reading. Did you actually do the reading, question? But it says, fill in the blank, influence efforts related to the creation, modification, and or preservation of government rules or restrictions that pit coalitions of businesses and industry associations against non-business organizations like unions, consumer groups, and environmental organizations are referred to, at least in your central concept reading, as blank, right? Well, this is actually a straight up quote from the reading, right? The answer is public interest games, right? And most of you got that, the vast majority of you obviously got that correct, right? The big distinction here is the idea that when firms, when you're competing, with government, this is from the reading, government games, right? So the idea is that when you're competing, trying to influence government in your competition with other firms, right, based on mergers and acquisitions and competition policy, these are things, those are value net games, right? So the idea is that the value net is the realm of the market, and so if you are trying to play government games related to how you compete with other firms in that value net, that's a value net game. But if it's about environmental regulations or safety requirements or things that non-business organizations, NGOs, consumer groups, those sorts of folks, environmental organizations, that they get involved in, now firms find themselves either competing or cooperating with these non-market players. That is known as public interest games. So that is it. That is the end of this presentation. I've gone through each of the 20 questions in some detail, but in great detail to the most challenging questions. I hope this has been educational, not just sort of looked at just as a test and how you did in the test, but I hope you will have learned from these. These concepts are not going to go away. They're going to be very important as you go forward into industry analysis and your industry studies in the spring in particular. All right, thank you.